If you look at the board, for those of you listening to the recording, I'll make sure a picture is taken of it and it gets put on the recording. But remember, the very first class we talked about this outline of Nehemiah and how we broke it down into two parts. And the first part, basically the first 7 chapters, is Nehemiah's commitment to rebuilding the wall. And we talked about after he hears about this bad news, we go into this idea where Nehemiah prays for this. And by going kind of into chapter 2 and starting off in verse 9 where we went last week, I want to take a step back real quick. And I want to talk about our response to bad news. How do we respond when we hear bad news? Now, your bad news can be extremely bad to you, and somebody else might hear it and go, that's it? That was no big deal. But whatever situation we're in, it's very self-interpretive to what actually bad news is. And obviously, to Nehemiah, hearing that the walls of Jerusalem have been torn down, that the city was in despair, it was horrible news for Nehemiah. So, what do we do? What is our response when we get bad news? Now, it's interesting when you think about different personality traits or different character traits of people, and they respond differently to bad news. Are you the type of person who sulks? You hear bad news and you get down on yourself, you stay in bed and eat chocolate and watch movies all day? Or are you the type of person who hears bad news and, man, it almost gives you a spur to take action and handle business? That's who Nehemiah was. Nehemiah heard this bad news. Now, he was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. So, realistically, Nehemiah could have just said, not my circus, not my monkeys. But it was Nehemiah's circus. It was his monkeys. It was his people. It was who he longed for, who he loved. It was his people. So he took action, and we see this idea in chapter 1 of him weeping and mourning. We talked about that concept of him being in this state for about 4 months. But then he didn't stop there. He didn't get over the idea of weeping and mourning. I just got done reading a book entitled Don't Take Away My Grief. And it talks about this idea of it's okay to cry. It's okay to be in mourning. It's okay to weep. You know, we live in this society, especially and me being a dad to a son, he gets hurt and I'm like, immediately get up, rub some dirt on it and move on. But listen, not all of our wounds in this world can be healed by rubbing some dirt on it. And it's okay to weep. It's okay to be in mourning. Don't take away my grief, he says. But then he doesn't stop there. He continues and goes to his God. And last week, after we started into chapter 2, it's interesting. After he goes to the king, look at verse 4. He goes to the king and it says, and the king said to me, by what are you requesting? What did he do again? Well, he prays in chapter 1, and then he goes to the king, and then the king says, what are you requesting? So what does Nehemiah immediately do then after that question is given? He prays again, right? Action. He takes action. Remember last week we said, then what? This action that Nehemiah takes, I think, is the action, and the number item, number 4 on this list, is where we fail. You know, we have to be ones to take action. You know, last week it was brought up, faith without works is what? Dead. And we see that whole concept developed in James, where he's trying to get people to show their faith by their works. How you live and how you act and how you function, how you raise your children, how you respond to hard trials and times in our lives, that's going to prove who we are. But it takes action beyond just sitting down and praying and allowing God to take control. We want to give it to God. But I think there's a fine line sometimes in our life that we don't show our faith by our actions, by our works. So what does Nehemiah do? And I kind of want to get us into our text for this morning in Nehemiah chapter 2 in verse 9. I want us to understand the actions that Nehemiah took. Now, we understand the weeping, mourning, and praying. All of us have been there. Over one thing or another, we've all wept, mourned, and prayed. But the next actions that Nehemiah faces are a lot more difficult. Number one, he goes to the king. Now, understand, this is like him going to his employer. And he's got a great relationship with his employer, and that one is pretty easy. But then what he's about to do is he's going to travel from where he's at to Judea about 1,000 miles on foot. They said it would take about 4 to 6 months. Not only was he traveling all of this distance, but remember, as we read last week, remember he would have to give letters so he could pass through certain regions, hostile regions. Not only was he given letters so he could pass through these regions, but an army of men went with him to keep him safe. So this wasn't like, hey, I'm gonna go over to the Greenway Trail and walk around for a while. You're safe. This was something that was going to take guts from Nehemiah. So here's the first question I have for you this morning. Where do we draw the line where we stop acting? Is it our comfort zone? Is it we're really good with taking action as long as it stays within our comfort zone? If it's something that I think I can do, I have no problem taking action on it. Maybe it's something that is easy. Oh, this is easy, so I can take action on it. I like to break down old vehicles and restore them, and there are certain things that I'm more comfortable doing than others. And I can have a list of things. And I'll have these list of things, and I'm going, okay, I could do that, I could do that, I could do that. And usually what happens is the thing that I'm least comfortable with gets pushed down to the bottom of the list. And then I get on the phone with George. Okay, George, I'm in over my head. I got this, and this done. But guess what happens when George doesn't answer? It may get pushed till tomorrow. Or I may just say, that's probably good enough how it is. Do we do that in our spiritual walk? Are we satisfied with subpar Christianity when it gets too tough? Are we satisfied with just being the status quo? Was Christ satisfied? No way. Christ understood that he was the only one that could take away the sin of man. You think it was comfortable and easy for Christ to willingly be led to that cross? What if Christ would have said, hey, I've wept, I've mourned, I've prayed? We see that all in Matthew chapter 26. Weeping, mourning, praying. And then he gets to the action and says, no way. No way am I going to be beaten and stripped and a crown of thorns pressed in my head. No way. Nehemiah walks about 1,000 miles. So he gets to Jerusalem. Let's go ahead and pick up the text in chapter 2, in verse 9. It says, then I came to the governors of province of beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and the horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servanthood heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. When I arose in the night, I had few men with me, and I had told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one in which I rode. I went out by night in the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the well, and I turned back and entered the way he started, by the valley gate. And the officials that did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were there to do the work. A plan is being concocted. Why do you think he goes at night? Why does we see the idea of him taking 3 days? You go back into Ezra, that's pretty standard. They think it may be an idea that for traveling this long, 3 days is the standard recoup time. But why do you think he went at night? It wouldn't have been a lot easier to see. I mean, he couldn't pull out his mag light. Obviously, there must have been some kind of full moon or had some kind of light source, but it would have been a lot easier to go during the day. But why did he go at night? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Okay, that was the idea of him rebuilding the walls. But he could have got there and said, hey, let's get a survey team out and let's go inspect these walls. But he doesn't do that. It makes very clear that he goes at night. What's going to happen later on in the book? Somebody who's read the book. What's going to happen when they start rebuilding the wall?
How many things you want to know?
Yeah. But to physically harm them, what's going to happen?
They had threats from their enemies. They had a lack of resources.
Okay, lack of resources, threats.
Problems within, problems without.
At one point, you could see a husband and wife switching off. And while the husband builds, the wife stands guard. And then they switch off. While the wife builds, the husband stands guard. Now, does that seem like a safe environment to do work? OSHA wouldn't have approved of that. Okay? Caitlin?
It kind of reminds me of the same concept of like when Monty talks about how they have that people at night.
Absolutely. Yeah. So going back to this word action, how many of us would have thrown in the towel and said, this is far too dangerous for me? And Monty is a great example of that. How many of us are brave enough, are bold enough, or let me rephrase that. How many of us are committed enough to the Lord's work to do it no matter what? So he makes this plan. He's at night and he goes and concocts this plan. He doesn't want anybody to know about it yet because he doesn't know who's internal that's going to be a mole and get the word out, and all of a sudden somebody's going to come and thwart the idea of rebuilding the wall. We see Sanballat and Tobiah. They were upset. They were displeased greatly, the text says in verse 10, that Cohen had to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So people didn't want them to succeed. Guess what? People don't want the church to succeed today. People want the church to fail. Satan, right now, hates the fact that you are here with your Bible open. He wants you to fail. Therefore, he will put temptations in your way and things in your way. And we have to say, I've done the weeping, mourning, and praying. Am I willing to act now upon the door that God has opened for me to walk through? Gary?
No. He's, after you so well taught, travels 1,000 miles. These people are not too well acquainted with him.
Right.
If God has chosen him to be the leader, he better just step up there and act like he knows what he's talking about, because he does. And then say, now this is what we need to do.
Right.
Well, it makes sense. Don't just start, oh, well, let's send a committee out. You know, if
right.
you're the leader, you don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
That's the problem is.
And that brings up a great point as we get in through the text. After he goes and inspects the walls in verse 16, he goes into verse 17. He says, then I said to them, you see the trouble that we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, listen to this charge, man. Great preacher. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer embarrassment, or some of your versions may say derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. Now notice that. He says he charges them. But then where does the charge really come from? God. He says, come, let us rebuild this wall so we're no longer an embarrassment. So no longer we have these problems that we have right now. See, part of the problems with the opponents is that they look at Jerusalem as weak right now. They look at the children of Israel as weak. They're in ruins. They don't have any power. Other nations are embarrassed by them. You may have that neighbor that never mows his lawn. Has trash out front. You drive by and you put your blinders up. That's what these other nations, they go by Jerusalem and put their blinders up. But they're weak. So he charges them. But not with his charge. He says in verse 18, and I told them of the hand of my God, that he had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And now they're going to begin building the wall. The only reason, and as a preacher I have to remember this, the only reason the people were stirred up was not because of the eloquent speech of Nehemiah, but because of God. We are all called to go and be evangelists in this world. And it gets discouraging. People don't want to hear it. They take forever, it seems like, and we get discouraged. But I love how Paul puts it to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians. Because he says, I planted, Apollos water, and God gave the growth. God gave the increase. And Nehemiah, the first 2 chapters, keeps going back to God. It's never, I am great, and I traveled these 1,000 miles, and I gave a great speech, and I want to do this. It's about what God put in his heart, and God's power, and God's good. By way of concluding this morning's class, I want to introduce a new idea that we can jump off with next week. Look at chapter 2 and verse 10. It says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly. And someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. From this point forward, you're going to see a major contrast in good and evil. Now here's a little fun fact, and you can go look it up. If you look up Blue Letter Bible online, you can search up a Hebrew interlinear. Okay, it's really easy. Anybody could do this. But there's 2 root words in the Hebrew that's about to come out over and over and over again. And it's Tob and Ra. Ra stands for evil or bad. And you see this idea in 1 through 3 and 2:17 really coming out as bad. There's things that displeased him, and there's evil amongst them. And the contrast, though, is the good. And you're going to see this develop really with the opponents that are going to come after the wall. But in this verse, in chapter 2 and verse 10, and then Stan, will you find Genesis 44 and verse 4 and read that for us in a minute? But in chapter 2 and verse 10, I want to point out this idea to you real quick. He says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased. That's our bad word. That's our Ra. R-A in English language. It's actually pronounced Raha, or depending on who you talk to. My Hebrew is not great, but you get the idea, okay? That's the idea of the word. But look at the contrasting word, the Tob, in this verse. He says, them greatly, and someone had come to seek the welfare or the good of the children of Israel. Like I said, from this point forward, you're going to see that idea. Stan, read Genesis 44 and verse 4, because we see the same concept happen there as well.
And when they had gone out of the city, and were not yet far off, Joseph said to his steward, get up, follow the men, and when you
Okay, that evil for good is our Ra and Tov. Okay, so you're going to see this come out. But where we just ended, go back down to verse 18. It said, and I have told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for what? For good. So you're going to see this battle begin taking place between good and evil, and Nehemiah is caught in the middle of it. He's caught in the middle of doing what God told him to do versus the opponents that are going to present this evil side. Listen, Nehemiah is so relevant for today. Because I can be willing to guarantee you that this week you will encounter the same concept. You ever seem like you're trying to do good, and the harder you try, Satan tries even harder? Just as you think you have something good figured out, something comes in and tempts you and you get down or you fall to that temptation. All week long, we're going to be tempted this way. This idea of displeasing God or pleasing God. And through the next really 5 chapters, we're going to see things that please God versus things that displease God.